Hi there, I'm Ben, student in the University of New Brunswick Intro to Adult Education class. Thank you for taking a few minutes to watch my presentation about one of the greatest cooperative adult education movements of all time. I may have a bias because it is rooted in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, where I spent my childhood. But I think as we move through, you will gain an understanding of how amazing the Antigonish movement really was, and hopefully agree with me that its success against such odds is fascinating. Now, because I'm a fan of stories that give you the ending first and then go back to show you how it all unfolded, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what still goes on today as a result of the Antigonish movement. Depicted here is an image of the Coady International Institute. The Coady Institute is located on the campus of St. Francis Xavier University, and to quote their website, the Coady International Institute ignites leadership that inspires collaborative efforts to address challenges, discover opportunities, and create sustainable development at the community level. Since 1959, the Coady Institute has been spreading and expanding upon the lessons learned through the Antigonish movement. In fact, the Coady Institute is named after the Reverend Dr. Moses Coady, who could probably be considered the hub of the movement's momentum through its early days. Working alongside the Coady Institute, in pursuit of Moses Coady's vision of creating a full and abundant life for all, as quoted on their website, is St. Francis Xavier University's Extension Department. In fact, most of the Extension Department staff actually work inside the Coady International Institute building on the St. Francis Xavier campus. The Extension Department, who Coady was the founding director of, is still engaged in promoting community cooperation, engagement, and leadership. In contrast to the Coady Institute, which is international interest and engagement, the Extension Department focuses more on local and regional initiatives within Canada. Meanwhile, if it is some more formal academic credentials you're interested in, the St. Francis Xavier Education Department offers a certificate, a diploma, or even a master's degree program in adult-specific education, drawing on a rich history of almost 90 years of leadership around adult-specific education. So, how did we get here? What started this revolutionary change in rural Nova Scotia, and why did it grow into something that is still referenced in classrooms and in practice around the world? The Coady Institute cites having thousands of graduates and partners working in 130 countries, still on the momentum started by the Antigonish movement, in some ways over 100 years ago. How can that be? Well, let's dive into a bit of the history and see what we learn. Before we step back into history together, though, let me review my objectives for this presentation. Whenever I start out on developing a new project or program about a subject that I know nothing about, I like to write down these 7 questions. This way, when I start to review material, I can sort it into these categories so that I can come back to it in some sort of systematic approach. So, the expansion on these questions I came up with was: who were the key players, and who was the intended audience? What was the Antigonish movement? I also wondered, what is it today? But I've cheated and already covered that. What was the movement's objectives and outcomes, and ultimately, what can be learned from it? On a foundational level, where is Antigonish? And somewhat related to why, is there a link to the geographical location and the evolution of the movement? Also, under the where question, it is interesting to examine where the movement's activities took place on a more local level, because they certainly weren't meeting in university campus lecture halls on a regular basis. As we'll see, the when category collected some interesting insights into the chronology of the movement. The evolution of the movement ties closely to what was going on in that particular region over the last century. The next question, and perhaps the most difficult information to interpret, is why. Why did the movement begin? It seems practical 100 years later, but lots of other parts of the world have suffered hard times without turning it into an international movement. So why was it successful? And why did it gain such widespread recognition? Then we come to how. The first how question is a big one. How did the movement work logistically? And we'll see pieces of that as we move through the other categories. That could probably be a university class all on its own, but we'll cover some of the high points. Next, how well did it work? This is tough to know because it's retrospective and subjective, but there are definitely some successes to highlight and some examples of lessons learned the hard way. Last, we come to the how much category. I don't spend a lot of time on the information that ended up in this category because most of it relates to the credit unions and the co-ops and the staffing numbers. This quantitative stuff doesn't lend a lot of added value when exploring the movement's contributions to adult education, but it's certainly interesting, and I'll squeeze a little bit of it in as evidence of growth and success near the end. So, let's get started. First, let's review the two key figures in the movement's history. Like any successful movement, there were many key players that kept things moving behind the scenes or were out in the front lines working with communities. These two figures were the driving forces at the center of it all. We have spoke a bit about Moses Cody already, as he bears most of the fame for the movement. It could be argued, though, that Father Tompkins was the one that started the ball rolling. Tompkins was 12 years Cody's senior, and when Cody returned as faculty of St. FX, Tompkins was already the vice president of the university and heavily engaged in exploring adult education models. By the time Cody returned to St. FX in 1924 from his work establishing a teachers' union in Nova Scotia, Father Tompkins had already been setting the stage for Cody's ideas to flourish. Tompkins had been writing educational newspaper articles and hosting conferences for several years, including his famous pamphlet 3 years earlier titled Knowledge for the People, A Call to St. Francis Xavier's College. The pamphlet reportedly asked, "How can we be of service to you?" and called upon the community and the university to work together for social reform. This conversation was generating interest, but it is Cody who was credited for the model of cooperative study groups and empowering learners to become leaders. In fact, when Cody returned to the university, Tompkins was already gone after some controversy around whether to engage in a proposed federation of universities. The bishop had grown tired of Tompkins' pressure in support of the university federation and moved him to a remote parish in Canso. At the time, the community Canso was only accessible by boat and was seriously impoverished. He was later able to employ his ideas in the community, though, and fascinated some of the facilitated. He was able to employ some of his ideas in the community and facilitated some of the great success stories of the Antigonish movement when we look back later on. Unfortunately, I can't fit all of the influential parties involved, like the Assistant Director of the Extension Department, Angus MacDonald, or the Sisters of St. Martha's, who worked both on the front line and behind the scenes, or the Scottish Catholic Society of Canada, that lobbied for the creation of the Extension Department at St. FX in the first place. But when looking for lessons learned, it is important to recognize the value of having a variety of engaged stakeholders. In isolation, one or two men would never have been able to make a difference. So, after all that, what was the Antigonish movement anyway? Well, as rural and remote communities increasingly suffered outmigration and poverty as a result of industrialization, the Antigonish movement aimed to change that trend. To quote Masters of Their Own Destiny, the Cody story, they describe the general purpose of the Extension Department as the improvement of the social, economic, and educational and religious conditions of their people. They wanted to create a self-sustaining cooperative system that was enlightened by adult education. That sounds like a great objective. But what was the strategy, you may wonder? Well, another great lesson comes from the strategy, or I should say strategies. They didn't just pick one approach and stick with it. They transmitted information through print and through radio. They hosted short courses. They promoted and facilitated study groups. They put on leadership courses and speaking competitions. They participated in correspondence and promoted debates. This increased the likelihood that adults would find an avenue that engaged them, improving the odds of participation. The other smart thing they did was engage the social networks that already existed. They didn't try to create a standalone project in a silo, but again, to quote Masters of Their Own Destiny, they considered clergy, churches, government officials, agricultural representatives, existing cooperatives, community associations, and community professionals as partners in their work. I won't spend a lot of time on where, but it does hold some significance that I've already highlighted. Rural Nova Scotia, after the Industrial Revolution was over, was a difficult place to live. The people had a history of fishing, mining, and agriculture, but money and investment was going into urbanization and mechanization, making it hard for isolated rural citizens to thrive. Education quality was inconsistent, under-resourced, and under-prioritized. This setting made the area an ideal region for such a movement to gain traction. The people were hard-working, but feeling out of options, and the church was going through an evolution as well, an evolution of purpose and looking for ways to re-engage with the population. The perfect scenario for a couple of visionaries to come along. The other aspect of where that I found interesting and relevant was where people congregated to learn. The Antigonish Movement brought the learning to the people in their own environment. It didn't allow location or ability to travel to be a barrier to learning. The true community-based aspect of the movement is still being promoted by the Cody International Institute today. As Diane Conrad points out in Chapter 13 of Fundamentals of Adult Education, the issue of access in adult education, privilege, and possibility. Moses Cody and his cousin Jimmy Tompkins traveled Nova Scotia to encourage cooperative participation from that province's workers. She goes on to say that over the years, however, most notably in the boom of the 1960s, adult education in Canada became institutionalized in bricks and mortar structures that responded to a different calling, the education and credentialization of the country's youth population. This evolution has made it hard for movements like the one started in Antigonish a century ago to maintain support and momentum. A gap between those that can afford access to education and those that can't continues to exist. As society and technology continues to evolve, we continue to need visionaries who can promote cooperative education and bridge those barriers. Now let's talk about when. By the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution was over and centralization was affecting most of the country. Small pockets of cooperatives and societies were starting to form, but not in the organized fashion that the Antigonish movement saw through St. FX's Extension Department in the years following its 1928 inception. They were able to learn from the Workers' Education Association, which had made its way to Canada from England 10 years earlier, and from the other universities around North America that had already begun extension work. The fact that other examples existed made it possible for Moses Cody to travel extensively, learning from the experiences of a variety of other groups. I suspect by now you have gained a sense of why the movement began. The local economy was in crisis, the young people were leaving in favor of industrialized cities, and the priests, who were locally born and raised, and were some of the few who had access to higher education, saw the plight of their people and an opportunity to provide a solution. The success, from my perspective, was driven by a few things. I've already mentioned going to the people in their communities. Also, they took a learner-centered approach, engaging the learner in developing programs and making them leaders in their respective communities. This promotes ownership and buy-in of the target audience. The other observation I made was in relation to conflict theory, that they set the objectives around social and economic reform and local collaboration. These tangible goals help engage people for the long-term commitment and effort that would have been required. And finally, why the recognition? Well, I see that as attributable to the tangible results. The collaboration and networking led to measurable changes in economic status for the region. These types of results had not been seen at the same scale in a time that most of the country was rural and looking for a solution to its similar challenges. As we get close to the bottom of the list, I've already let slip lots of the secrets of how, logistically speaking, the movement actually worked. To elaborate a little on the complex network of approaches, let me borrow a quote from the Masters of Their Own Destiny website that I think illustrates it well and offers an example of scaffolding. Local communities were organized into neighborhood groups, usually composed of 5 to 10 members who met in homes, halls, and schoolhouses. Most communities would have several groups, and these kitchen study clubs became a distinctive feature of the movement. Study clubs fostered a process whereby ordinary people, with the guidance of field workers or others, read and studied on their own. They then brought back their ideas for debate and elaboration. The clubs studied various subjects: credit unions, cooperative methods, home economics, and farming and fishing techniques. The people decided what they wanted to learn about. As study and discussion proceeded, leaders would emerge who helped to initiate practical cooperative projects. These projects often succeeded because they were adapted to local circumstances and needs. Furthermore, they had the support of the community." End quote. So, as you can see, the initiatives would start small and theoretical, and then progress into actual projects that eventually led to a participation picture that looked like this. Thanks to the collaboration between Moses Cody, Jimmy Tompkins, and their dedicated team of people, they were able to take an idea and turn it into a program that had over 10,000 members in the eastern end of rural Nova Scotia. Their efforts led to the opening of 142 credit unions, along with a large variety of other cooperatives around the region. While Cody focused his efforts through the University Extension Department, Tompkins spent his time guiding some of the most challenged communities firsthand, creating examples that the rest of the movement used as flagship examples of success. Together, these efforts created a result that is still studied for lessons to this very day. I hope you have enjoyed my short presentation about the Antigonish Movement and what can be accomplished when people are effectively guided to work together for a common goal and empowered to learn. Thank you.